This article was first published in the Seattle Happenings magazine for the annual Look Back section, issue 34, in January 2022. The 1990s were filled with punk rock legends and tragedy. Too many great artists died in their prime, just on the cusp of making it big. For every Kurt Cobain, there is an Eddie Nelson. For every Nirvana, there is a chirping crickets. While Cobain's passing is often acknowledged, Nelson's is rarely regarded. Most people know Eddie Nelson from his role as lead guitarist in the grunge band Chirping Crickets. Eddie was more than just another victim of Seattle's meat grinder. He was a real human being with hopes and dreams. This year marks the 30th anniversary of Nelson's passing. We'll be looking back at his life, his bandmates, his friends, and his killer. Eddie's friends, fans, family, and surviving band members remember him with fondness tinted with resentment and hurt. Nelson was sometimes called Buddy by his close friends, due to his alleged resemblance to Buddy Holly, a nickname he resented. Yet Eddie was often eclipsed by those he held closest in his life. His bandmates would go on to much larger and more noticeable projects. Rhythm guitarist Jim Forrester would eventually front the eponymous Minus Jim. Bassist Peter Rosenberg would make the switch to guitar and become one of the most recognized lead guitarists and singers in modern metal. Frontwoman Katrina Kat Bogota Riviera would reform the surviving members of the band into El Pollo Conquistador. Kat's new band would do 2 European and West Coast tours before her tragic murder at 27. If we were to speculate as to why Eddie Nelson wasn't remembered as vividly as his bandmates, it is sadly because he was in the shadow of Kat's death. She was a Latin American punk icon. To the protests of her bandmates, she is considered a feminist martyr. Both Peter and Jim have gone on record saying that Kat would not have wanted her murder to eclipse her legacy as a musician. Yet they are painfully silent when it comes to Eddie's murder. Often in interviews, they shrug it off. In one scene in the documentary, Kat Bogota, A Life on the Edge, Jim, when asked about the death of Eddie, said,
"There was a lot of bad blood between us at that point." Well, no, it was more like, it felt like he wasn't really showing up for us emotionally, you know? We had a friend OD. It was painful. He wouldn't show up at the funeral. He overslept. We always knew he was a night owl. You couldn't get him out of the house before 6. Hell, sometimes in the summer, it wasn't until 9 that he'd leave.
Peter Rosenberg is also infamously coy when talking about Eddie Nelson. In the same documentary, Pete had much more curt words for Nelson.
Buddy wasn't a good fit, you know? It was weird having him in the first incarnation of the band. He had some ego, acting like he was gonna be the biggest thing ever. He wasn't mean. He wasn't even a braggart. He just didn't know how to rein it in. Kat picked him because he was wicked sick with a guitar. Don't get me wrong, I miss the guy, and it was a tragedy what happened to him. But sometimes a dude, no matter how righteous that guy is just a bad fit for a band. It's sad what happened to him. But in all honesty, I think we all knew something was up.
It's particularly hard to pinpoint what that something was. Eddie Nelson came to Seattle in 1987, years before the grunge wave took over the radio. Records about him are scarce. The Seattle Police Department only had the vaguest idea of what his life was like upon completing their investigation. He worked odd jobs during late-night shifts. His hours were erratic. Often he worked as a barista or a clerk at 24-hour stores. He was infamous for only showing up when he felt like it and leaving work early. Investigators concluded that this was due to his addiction to heroin. The medical examiner theorized that Eddie had developed a severe sensitivity to light in the last years of his life, and his lack of eating and drinking habits were yet another side effect of heroin. Eddie first got noticed by Jim Forrester at an open mic night. Jim was just 19 at the time. He was a runaway from Chicago and worked at an all-night diner located on Capitol Hill. Eddie was also from Chicago and kept similar hours. They had a lot in common. After or before work, depending on his shift, Jim would perform at the Comet's open mic night. Comet regulars included Peter Rosenberg, Kat Riviera, and Eddie Nelson, who worked barback. One night, after Jim finished his set, Eddie asked to borrow his guitar. Jim initially said no, but was persuaded by Kat to give Eddie a shot. By the end of Eddie's set, everyone was blown away. They formed the band Chirping Crickets that very night. The name was a joke as to what kind of reception they expected to get when performing together. Flash forward to November of 1990. Chirping Crickets performs at the Central Tavern for a devoted audience of local fans. Kat's vocals and Eddie's guitar solos are the main draw of the crowd. Kat was compared to Janis Joplin in terms of her moody, soulful voice. Eddie often got compared unfairly to Buddy Holly because of his appearance and not necessarily his guitar style. Despite his umbrage with it, the comparison was made as a compliment. Now enters Nathan, Eddie's killer. In the audience one Saturday night was producer Nate Berg. Nate owned a local studio that doubled as a small label called Tomahawk Records. The label catered to more conservative acts, with most of the band signed being in the country music genre. It was initially thought that Nate signed the Chirping Crickets to get in on the ground floor and take advantage of the grunge wave. Detectives now think he did so out of a psychotic obsession with Eddie Nelson. Nathan Berg was born in the Fieldston neighborhood of the Bronx, New York. His family were Jewish immigrants, his father a chef, and his mother a librarian. Nathan seemed to live a charmed life in the affluent neighborhood, sheltered from the rest of decaying New York City. All this would change when he was sent to Bishop Ford High School in Brooklyn, New York. Bishop Ford was a Catholic school that was easily a 2-hour subway ride from his home in the Bronx. During his 4 years there, Nathan's behavior changed, and he quickly found himself in trouble with the law. He was arrested for assaulting a man he claimed was gay in the East Village at age 17. After graduating high school, he married his high school sweetheart, but they divorced a few months later. His second wife, Christine, would later come forward to testify about his erratic and abusive behavior. During his marriage to Christine, Louis Moss, better known by his friends as L.M., was stabbed by Nathan in downtown Manhattan, Nathan claiming that Christine was having an affair with Louis. Louis survived the stabbing and went to the police. Nathan Berg pled guilty to first-degree assault with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released on good behavior a mere 3 years into his sentence. By the time he reached Seattle in 1984, Nathan had moved on to his fifth wife. He had picked Seattle because he believed it to be a conservative city. In his private life, it was often rumored he had ties to a small KKK chapter located out on the Olympic Peninsula, a few miles' drive from Port Orchard. The more the police learned about Nathan Berg's life, the more obvious it became that signing the band was out of character by miles. Unfortunately for the band, despite protests from Jim Forrester on Nate's red flags, they signed a one-album deal. That self-titled album, Chirping Crickets, is most notable because it gives us our best photo of Eddie Nelson. In earlier photos of the band, Eddie is always in the background making silly faces or monkeying around with his bandmates. This album cover, however, is a straightforward group shot with the band's name on it. Now, despite repeated requests to license the rights to this image, I can't show the album cover due to copyright issues. Instead, I'll describe it to the best of my ability. At front and center is Kat Riviera. Kat is smiling and sticking her tongue out, her brown skin contrasting with the gray brick, graffiti-covered wall behind them. She has several bright metallic piercings, and her hair is done up in what could be best described as a dreadlock mullet. Most of her clothes are black, with one exception. She is wearing her signature T-shirt, a torn-up white shirt with the words Bogota, hand-painted in black, sloppily designed to look like a sports jersey. To her left is Jim Forrester. Jim is a white man wearing a buttoned-up red flannel shirt. He vaguely resembles a very young John Waters, but appearing straight and more muscular. He wears narrow rectangular glasses and has a pencil mustache. He's trying to look serious, but smirking just a tiny bit. To Kat's right is Peter Rosenberg. Peter is a bit larger than the rest, He has a gigantic bushy beard and long, flowing black hair. He's wearing a Megadeth t-shirt, his arms covered in tattoos. He has his bass guitar in one hand, the words "Suck It" painted across the body. Joel Atkins, the drummer, is to Jim's left. He's a blond man wearing a t-shirt under his plaid flannel shirt. There's absolutely nothing remarkable or noticeable about him. Finally, there is Eddie Nelson himself. He's wearing a black blazer with a Green River t-shirt underneath. His curly hair is down to his shoulders. His face has some vague resemblance to Buddy Holly if you squint and try to see it. He's not wearing glasses, but is holding a cherry-red hollow-body Les Paul in his hand. His expression is one of muted triumph. He seems to be the happiest of the group. After the group's first and only studio album was released, people started to pay attention to Eddie. More people began to attend his shifts at the Comet. His once solitary life was left in tatters. Eddie had mixed feelings about his newfound attention. On one hand, this is when his popularity spiked in the community. But before this, he was the loner known primarily for his eccentric habits and photophobia. Now people were asking him for guitar lessons and jam sessions. He got approached by quite a few local bands to join them. Soon he was being approached by local venue owners to play solo shows. One such person to allegedly approach him was none other than Kevin Christoph Fallon, the future murderer of Kat Riviera. This is the point in Eddie's life where we finally get the most information about him. He was born in Austin, Texas in 1958. His family moved to Chicago in 1967, where he would attend a local music school. He was keen to leave out the names of the schools he attended and the places he worked. This made it extremely hard for investigators to track down anything about his past. Despite his alleged drug addiction, he looked surprisingly youthful. And despite other substance abuse theories, he was known to publicly avoid alcohol, cigarettes, weed, and fast food. His lifestyle also consisted of regular fasting. In his work, Eddie was often categorized as unreliable. He worked what he called Eddie hours, where he would show up and leave when he felt like it. But in spite of this, people were surprisingly lenient with him. It was also later discovered that he sometimes volunteered at local hospitals in a capacity that was never released to the public. Despite it adding to his allure, his unreliability held him back as a musician. Chirping Crickets was prevented from going on a West Coast tour with Eddie due to his unreliability. The band had no expectations of fame nor any desire to become famous, so it was not a source of contention. Jim Forrester had this to say in an interview with NPR in 2008.
It wasn't like we were going anywhere, you know? Like, what were we planning anyway? Most of us were stuck working gigs. Kat was too much of a socialite. At the time, she was struggling with a drinking problem. Peter was already in 2 other bands, and he was considered the real hot ticket of us, to be honest. At the time, grunge was this swinging dick competition. They wanted all male bands. They wanted Peter. Me and the rest of the guys were too straight-laced. They wouldn't even give Kat the time of day just because of her skin color. And I do think racial bias played a role. I'm not calling them racist, like, not all, but they just couldn't see her talent because of how she was. It was a real crime.
1991 was a blur for the band. In local zines and interviews, Kat tends to do the talking with interludes from rhythm guitarist Jim. The dynamics of the band reflected each member's personality. Kat was the center of it all. Jim was the up-and-coming artist who wanted the spotlight but wasn't willing to overshadow Kat out of respect. Peter, the bassist, was considered his own man, independent from most of the bands he played with. Sure, he was part of those bands, but never really in them from the eye of the public. Drummer Joel Atkins was a deeply private man who retired from music in 1996. He has since moved to Olympia, disappearing from the public eye entirely. And Eddie Nelson would be the local man of mystery. Who was Eddie? He showed up to parties late, was notoriously unreliable, and generally acted strange all around. Yet at the same time he was charming, nice, gentlemanly. You could say what you wanted about his habits and work ethic, but no one had a bad word to say about his personality. His kind demeanor and aloof nature left people wanting more. Perhaps the best example of his fun-loving and eccentric side was told by Kat in an interview about 3 months following his death. When asked about Eddie, she recalled this story.
One time we were at the Comet. Every time, every night, Wild times. I had too much to drink every night. But this time, I was not doing walking. Too much whiskey legs. So Eddie picks me up and has me on his shoulder, but I fall off. So he's got his guitar in one hand, me in the other. So he takes the guitar out of the case and loosens the strap and hoists me in it like a baby. I'm just stuck in the strap to keep from falling over. He says, "Okay, we're going to do a new act. Here it is. Conjoined twins. We're going to go on stage in a giant suit and fight over the guitar. It's going to be a comedy act. So we're going to practice walking in unison." So we tried doing it right there. We started singing, playing, and walking like conjoined twins. I was like, "This is my brother Eddie. You can tell he's uncut Colombian because look how white he is." It doesn't sound funny when I say it like this, but when we were there and drunk, it was a riot. He didn't get down the block before we fell on our backs laughing. Stuff like this made Eddie special. He was weird and had this great Texas accent. His voice was so soft and gentle. He was a gentleman, Great guy. I miss him a lot.
Yet these good memories would soon be tainted by interpersonal strife. All of this would come to a head when the band's roadie and close friend, Wayne Berg, no relation to Nathan Berg, died suddenly. Wayne had been driving drunk with his wife Cassandra and their daughter Cassidy in the car. He crashed into a light pole, killing both his wife and daughter, and left him debilitated with a permanent spine injury from which he would never recover. He overdosed a few months later. His death hit the band pretty hard, as Wayne and his wife were devoted fans who attended almost every show. Their funerals were held in Comet Lodge Cemetery, but because Wayne's family had disowned him, and no one was able to find Cassandra's family, the three were buried in a pauper's field. This insult to injury deeply wounded the community, including the chirping crickets, that considered Wayne and his family their friends. Despite the services being held so far from their homes, the band, minus Eddie, attended the ceremony. This rift would develop into some resentment. Even the benevolent Kat had her limits. Yet this was not the worst to come. All this time, behind the scenes, Nathan Berg had made a habit of stalking Eddie. Nate's label did sign 2 more grunge acts. The first was Trash Flame, a band of little note. The other band was Skeeter Jeter, of which there is also little recorded. But artists complained of Nathan's attitude. He was smug and argumentative, and was well documented as openly hating women. The rumors of him being a member of a local KKK group were dispelled when police tailed him prior to his arrest. The group he was part of was nothing more than a poker night that met in the back room of a gas station. The group put up a sign saying, "Closed for KKK meeting," on the front door as a joke in poor taste. In October of 1992, after over a year of stalking, Nathan Berg broke into Eddie Nelson's apartment. Eddie lived in a basement with the windows taped over with garbage bags. Berg had pulled down the bags to wake Eddie, and then promptly killed Eddie Nelson in cold blood. Nathan then proceeded to set Eddie's body on fire. Somehow he managed to cremate his entire body within a short period of time, a relatively unheard-of phenomenon. This is the only recorded case of human combustion in which alcohol was not involved. Investigators were conflicted on this matter, as Eddie's outward refusal to drink may simply have been a lie. Most cases of spontaneous human combustion involved elderly female alcoholics. Eddie was an exception to the rule. Still, his substance abuse no doubt played a role in this. Multiple witnesses confirmed Nathan Berg's presence at the apartment building before and after the murder. Nathan was arrested 3 days later at his studio. His trial was relatively short, with only 1 day of jury deliberation. At his trial, many of his previous wives would testify, most damning being his second wife, Christine Berg. Nathan Berg was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Christine Berg was committed to an asylum due to her diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in 2006. Louis L.M. Moss also testified and would later commit suicide in 2009. These events would lead to an appeal filed in 2010. This appeal was denied, and Berg died in prison in 2016 from rectal cancer. After Eddie Nelson's murder, the band did mourn his passing. The community mourned as well for a time. The problem with Eddie being an enigma is that few people had serious attachments to him. The band took a few months off from playing gigs. It wasn't until Jim contacted the band members to start a new project that they would get together again. This new band was named by Kat El Pollo Conquistador. They would go down as a punk rock Seattle legend. The rest is history. Today, portraits of Katrina Riviera can be found across the Northwest and in other cities. Her face is well known to many people in the punk and grunge scenes. Yet Eddie Buddy Nelson slipped through history's cracks. His death was relatively unmarked and overshadowed. His life was soon forgotten. Most people today only bring him up for the bizarre way in which he died. Yet his guitar playing was unique, fast, and almost anachronistic. Despite his aloofness, there was a brief moment in which Eddie Nelson was the star of the show. His mysterious nature was an attraction that helped get the band noticed in some regard, at least within Seattle. Eddie was the spark that got people talking about the band in many ways. His death was tragic, his life an enigma. Writing about Eddie Nelson is often challenging. His life is poorly documented. He stood shoulder to shoulder with three legends, but few people knew him. Yet the two biggest obstacles in writing about him are his murder and the hilarious accusations of vampirism. Yes, you read that right, vampirism. To this day, a search for Eddie Nelson online brings up hordes of conspiracy pages and surreal memes. As much as I am loath to give this any attention, I should address it in at least some part. Yes, there are people who genuinely believe Eddie Nelson is the vampire Buddy Holly. I have no words for these people besides, you need help. But rather than take this as an insult to his legacy, I think it highlights his charismatic nature despite so little being known about him. That he could be enigmatic and yet so enthralling. It's easy to see why people gravitated towards him in some form of admiration or morbid curiosity. I think back to that album cover. His cocksure grin, chin up, his steely eyes, the shape of his face looking mischievous altogether. And if you squint hard enough and let your imagination do a lot of work, just maybe you might see a fang poking out of that grin.